Hello and welcome to today's Australian Water School webinar addressing the problem with PFAS. I'm your host, Cray Price, and I'm pleased to be joined today by some experts on the topic at hand. Now, the alarm bells around PFAS have been ringing for quite a while, and today's experts are here to help shed some light on what these chemicals are and why we should care about the increasing levels being found in our drinking water in particular. But before we dive in, I wanted to mention that today's webinar is sponsored by Ocean Protect. They are a developer of solutions to manage impacts of stormwater runoff on the environment. So very relevant today. So thanks very much to our sponsor. And now let's welcome all of you, today's webinar attendees from right around the world. We've got almost 1,000 attendees from 50 countries. So this is very much a global audience. And this is a global problem that definitely needs a global response. Now, let's welcome today's presenters. If you can turn your cameras on and introduce yourselves. Brad Dalrymple, he's been with us before. Brad, we all certainly appreciate everything you do to help get the word out about some really important topics, including previously coming on to some of our Australian Water School webinars that dealt with plastic pollution. We had river health and coral reefs, climate change, and some other hot topics. Brad, you wear a lot of hats, a podcaster, lecturer, vendor, consultant, activist. But let us know where you're joining us from today, and maybe if you remember, when did you first hear the term PFAS?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Grant. Thanks for everyone who's joining us. Big turnout, big topic. I'm an environmental engineer with Ocean Protect. I've been with the Ocean Protect team for about 6 years. First time I heard the term PFAS, I reckon it was probably 8 or 9 years ago. It was actually as a consultant. I can't tell you who it was for or where it was, but I've been trying to get my head around PFAS ever since. And it's one of those things that you learn stuff every day. It's a very rapidly evolving area.
Yeah, great. Karl, first time joining an Australian Water School webinar, but welcome. And same question to you, where you're coming to us from today, and how long has it been since you first heard about this problem?
Thanks, Cray. I'm coming to you from Dalrymple land, which is in the south of Sydney. For those who aren't aware, Dalrymple is one of our Aboriginal communities, and just sort of acknowledging that I'm on their land. When I didn't first hear PFAS, I first heard PFC. Because back when I heard about it, a lot of people were still talking about PFCs, not PFAS. And one of the early things that I did in this space was actually trying to explain to other people in the New South Wales government why we needed to be talking actually about these things called PFAS, not PFCs. That was maybe 2015. First risk assessment landed on my desk. Since then, I've been involved in PFAS in many, many ways. Both working within government or for government as a consultant for private clients. I've done stuff in the risk assessment space, for example, looked at emerging treatment technologies. I had a lot to do with drafting of the initial PFAS NEMP, National Environmental Management Plan, which we'll talk a bit about today. I've got over 20 publications on PFAS, some of which have achieved quite a bit of attention. So, I've been right in the thick of it for 10 years or so.
Sounds good. And I think that qualifies you as an expert, which looking at our poll results, we wanted to see what's the background level of the attendees today. And they're typical for these kinds of webinars. Usually commercial and consulting leads the way. In our case, though, today we have a lot in government policy and planning. And so welcome, especially if there are new attendees to this webinar who haven't been with us before. Welcome to all of you. We hope to bring you lots of relevant content going forward. So the question on how much you know about PFAS, overwhelmingly, everybody says, I know a little. So there are a few who are brand new to it. And I have to admit, I had to Google the term again to remind myself what it even stood for. My exposure to it, I think, was really brought to light. I guess it was that movie Dark Waters a while back that really brought more attention back to this subject. And, maybe some of you are in the same boat where it's just a little bit of Googling and you've heard that as a problem, read a couple of studies. What is this? Is this really something seriously to be alarmed about, or is it getting overblown? That's why we brought you to today's experts. So any surprises there, Karl? Is this what you would have expected from a sampling of 1,000 people out there attending a webinar like this, to have no experts and just a handful who say they know a lot about it. Most of us saying we know a little. Any surprises there to you?
Well, actually, it's nice to have a bunch of people who accept they're not experts on PFAS.
As opposed to what you read online, you'd think there's experts all over the place.
Brad, same question. Oh, sorry, back to you, Karl.
No, all good.
Brad, same question to you.
Yeah, maybe. I think maybe a lot of people are being very modest. I certainly do not claim to be an expert. It's a hell of a topic. So keen to dive into it.
Yeah, and for the rest of the questions, we did put you on the spot, a couple of technical questions there, but Brad has got some slides on these. We'll compare at the time when you show the real answers. We'll kind of compare that, maybe make reference to where people thought the biggest problems were and what some of the sensitivities are, and how prevalent is this problem. So with that, Brad, as you want to share your screen, I just want to welcome everybody to, or invite everybody to put your questions into the Q&A line. Get them in early. What happens a lot of times, we'll get questions, 5 minutes before the end while we're wrapping up, and we won't have time to cover them. So get them in early so that we'll have a chance to have other attendees upvote them, and then we'll address them live as they come. So while Brad's talking, Karl can answer some questions in the background and vice versa. We'll come back on at the end for a live interactive panel discussion with you, the audience. In the meantime, though, Brad, I can see your screen just fine. We'll drop into the background while you present your topic. Over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Craig. And just note the big disclaimer on the bottom left corner, which we've done our best to put together as the accurate information as best we can, but it's not legal advice. Long story short, please read that disclaimer. But what are PFAS? Let's dive straight into it. So fundamentally, it's an acronym. It stands for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And long story short, they're a manufactured chemical, a manufactured forever chemical. That forever in that they last for a very, very long time in the environment and our bodies as well. Produced roughly since about the 1930s, but fundamentally they've got some very unique properties that make them a very handy chemical to use in a whole bunch of products. Makes basically stuff non-stick, oil and water repellent, fire resistant, etc. So fundamentally, you see it in a lot of stuff. Carpets, clothes, food, paper, etc., and particularly firefighting foams and also pesticides, etc. Karl.
Yeah, and what I want to point out is the massive diversity in PFAS. What I wanted to add on to what Brad said is that we tend to focus a lot on three particular PFAS, or a very, very small handful of PFAS. PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS. If you're in the US, you might be thinking about Gen X, for example. But actually, this is a class of chemical that is in the thousands or tens of thousands. And it's not just that there's lots of them, they're extremely diverse in their properties, which means they move differently in the environment, they have different toxicities, and they're going to have different treatment requirements. And all I'm doing here is I've got three examples. So I've got some firefighting foam, where you've got the chemical structure there. It doesn't matter if you're not a chemist. All I've done is I've put a circle around the bit of that chemical that makes it PFAS, and see all of those fluorines stuck on it. And then you have a look at, we've got an icon there for some alkaline batteries. Well, they've also got PFAS in them. But the PFAS, that chemical, again, if you're not a chemist, it doesn't matter. You can look at that chemical and look at the firefighting foam one. You can go, they're nothing like. So they're not going to behave remotely similarly in the environment. So we might have to do different things to manage those. And on the bottom right, the example there is a pharmaceutical. And, the classic example is Prozac. So Prozac has a little bit on its molecule that makes it technically a PFAS. And that has regulatory consequences too, because then you ask the question, are you going to ask people to stop taking Prozac because it happens to be a PFAS? So all I'm doing is pointing out a lot of diversity here. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Karl. Yeah, so I think at last count, I think there's about 14 or 15,000 different types of PFAS, depending on who you talk to. But what's all the fuss about? What are we talking about PFAS? Look, there's a bunch of reasons. Fundamentally, it seems to be quite nasty. It's reportedly toxic. It bioaccumulates. So the further you go up the food chain, it tends to absorb your fatty tissues, so it can go up the food chain. Fundamentally, we see it in pretty much everywhere. I'll show you some science in a sec. But it's linked to a whole bunch of negative health impacts, and subsequently, because of these things, it's a high priority for regulators, and increasingly so. And if you've, Carl mentioned the Dark Waters movie starring Mark Ruffalo, in between Incredible Hulking, he's playing a lawyer trying to sue PFAS manufacturers. But yeah, look, it's everywhere in the media, whether it's news articles, movies, Netflix docos, featured on Australian Story, generally around litigation, around PFAS contamination, around various sites, around, in this case, Australia and overseas. And also basically finding it in us, various products and various sort of ecosystems as well. Just to touch on some of those articles. So, for example, they're finding PFAS in rain as well. So a lot of people obviously think rain is falling from the sky. You'd think that it would be quite clean, but there's some a fair bit of evidence to indicate that rainfall has concentrations of PFAS that exceed reportedly safe levels. Subsequently, we also see it in surface and groundwaters. So, and it does. I guess some of these results are influenced by the fact that people often monitor PFAS or look for PFAS where they think PFAS is likely to occur. But fundamentally, we are seeing it in surface and groundwaters around the world, including Australia. In terms of, and I can only speak from an Australian perspective on this one, but is my water safe to drink? So the latest advice from the National Health and Medical Research Council is, generally PFAS levels in water provided by water utilities is generally well below current Australian drinking water guidelines. But then you see the occasional story like this, and this is one of the quiz questions for everyone playing at home, if they got it right. The Blue Mountains in August of last year. Water New South Wales disconnected the Medlow Dam because of elevated PFAS concentrations. And that's Blue Mountains. You'd think Blue Mountains, for those not in Australia, it's a pretty pristine area. But even in these areas, we're seeing elevated PFAS concentrations. And before everyone goes crying in their beer because of the PFAS dramas, the sad news is also there's PFAS in your beer. So a recent study of beer in the US sampled a bunch of beers and found that majority had PFAS concentrations at elevated levels. So sorry to spoil everyone's Wednesday. But then you look at ecosystems and ecology. And one of the quiz questions as well was, where do you find where is the highest recorded PFAS concentrations in dolphins? It's off the coast of southeast Australia, so off the coast of Victoria, off the coast of Melbourne, Port Phillip Bay, Gippsland, etc. The highest concentration recorded of PFAS in dolphins. And this is relative to areas like Hong Kong, China, etc. And they showed that, over 90% or roughly 90% of the critically endangered Barunnan dolphin had concentrations in their livers, basically indicating that they'd probably make them quite sick, unfortunately. Platypus, one of our most iconic species in Australia. And this is a really interesting study by Catherine Warwick out of the Western Sydney University, looking at PFAS concentrations in the livers of platypus in some fairly regional parts of New South Wales, and showing high concentrations of PFAS in those livers. We had a podcast with Catherine, if you want to tune into that. But look, she was surprised to see PFAS at all in these livers. But all of the platypus had concentrations. And getting back to humans, a recent study by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this is only a few weeks ago. This is why it's so hard to keep up, I think, with the PFAS research. Is literally this is just last month. A study released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that 98% plus of the Australian public have PFAS in their system, in their blood. I think it's something like 85%. This is one of the quiz questions as well. 85% of the Australian public had 3 or more types of PFAS in our blood. Okay. Karl, you still with us?
Okay, so there's different ways of looking at that information. So if you looked at that last slide from Bragg, you saw that most people have got PFAS in their blood, and that includes me. I've got about 2 nanograms per litre of PFAS in my blood because it's been measured. But this is another way of looking at how much is in your blood. And so what this is a study by researchers from Queensland. And they've looked at Australian data, they've looked at US data, and they've looked at the trend of PFAS in your blood over time, or people from the population. And focusing on this slide on PFOA, PFOS, and PFH excess, you see what you've got is the concentration vertically, and on the horizontal, you've got time. And in every case, you see that the concentration in blood has gone down enormously since 2005. And that trend of these concentrations going down over time is reflective of the fact that these specific PFAS are no longer really deliberately produced to use in commerce. So what we're seeing is gradually going away. This is really good news. Next, please, Brad. So this is a different PFAS. This is PFNA, which is like PFOA. There's just a slight twist, slight change to that molecular structure. But PFNA shows something different. What happened was, if you look at it over time, the concentrations first went up and then they came down. So what was happening here was you were seeing manufacturers, they were seeing the heat was on them for using PFOA. So they went, we're going to use something a little bit different that the regulators aren't concerned about. But then the heat came on that as well, so they stopped making that, so down it goes. Anyway, so we're seeing some really good signs and trends in terms of certain specific PFAS that we happen to be particularly concerned about. One click, Brad. So that raises a very sensible question. Well, what about other PFAS? And so we have our gaze, our regulatory gaze is very much on these specific PFAS. But does this apply to everything? So this is a slide I showed before, and so I've just brought this slide back to reiterate that point that the different PFAS that are used in commerce now are extraordinarily diverse. A lot of them we don't expect to be at any reasonable concentration in our bloodstream because our bodies don't hold on to them the same way they hold on to PFOS or PFOA. We take them in and then we just get rid of them, out through the loo. So there's reasons why we don't expect a lot of other PFAS to be building up in concentration in our bloodstream. Doesn't mean we're not exposed to them. It just means it's not quite the right measure. So, next slide.
Thanks, Karl. And look, on the human health front, and this paper is a little bit old, but basically just talks about the potential or likely links between PFAS, concentrations in the body or exposure and human health. And it's obviously hard to distinguish between causation and correlation, but there's certainly a lot of indications that indicates that PFAS has some potentially significant health implications, particularly around thyroid, various cancers, particularly autoimmune suppression and reproductive health as well. This study's about 5 years old, so it might have changed a little bit since then. But fundamentally, there's some evidence to indicate that there's potentially at least significant health impacts associated with PFAS exposure. Sorry, Clint.
Yeah, just before you move off that last one. So, look, it's really important to stress here that different groups of experts see this very differently. The people who wrote this study, there are some seriously good people in that author list, real experts, extremely good in their field. And yet there are other experts who go, we look at the same information and we don't see it quite the same way. So there are some people who look at the information that's available and they go, yes, there are signs of some of these things in the population, but the evidence is inconsistent. One study says there is, one study says there's not. So look, it's not my place to argue one side of the coin or the other. And the vast majority of people I meet, it's not their job either. What we do is we hand the information, we deal with the information that we're given to use and we do our job according to what our job happens to be. So in Australia, our Commonwealth guidance is, yes, there are some signs, but we're going to, for example, set our guidance values on the base of lab studies, not studies that show the possibility of some of these effects in human populations. So without getting too far in the weeds on that, just be careful that it is a very controversial space and that different experts have different opinions on what's clinically relevant and what's not.
Yeah, cool. And And look, there's a lot of evidence, like this is a map of PFAS contamination in the US, and you can read into this what you like, but long story short, there's a lot of areas that have PFAS contamination, whether it's in the US or within Australia or overseas. And to Karl's point, whilst the health impacts might be a little bit debated, a lot of groups are certainly taking a precautionary approach to mitigating any potential risk. And just as one stakeholder, for example, firefighting foam, at least historically, has had PFAS in it, and if you've got a fire training facility or a fire station, and a lot of airports, military bases do, for example, they often are considered a hotspot of PFAS contamination. So the Department of Defence, for example, has various sites around Australia with potential or observed PFAS contamination. So subsequently, they are just one stakeholder, but they are certainly spending a lot of money mitigating and monitoring and managing that risk. So to give you an example of some of the money involved here, human health and ecosystems aside, this is just brass tacks, dollars and cents. To date, they've spent, this is Department of Defence, a snapshot, this is publicly available information, they've spent $850 million on managing and remediating and researching PFAS. And just this current financial year alone, they were planning to spend $165 million on management and remediation of PFAS. So again, this is just one stakeholder that had used a substance that contained PFAS, and unknowingly that was later on identified as a pollutant of concern. And again, this is just one stakeholder. Throw in airports, fire training facilities, etc. There's some significant money being spent on managing and mitigating the risk associated with PFAS. So fundamentally, PFAS is a manufactured chemical. It's from manufacturers, and where we're seeing, I guess, in terms of the sources, the hotspots, if you want to use that term, it's generally these three general areas: military bases, airports, fire training facilities. But then you go down the path of secondary sources, and these are areas that haven't used PFAS themselves or produced it, but they are essentially conduits or receiving areas for PFAS contamination, such as landfills, wastewater treatment plants, etc. But fundamentally, these chemicals are made. So for the water professionals out there, often, and water utilities, storm professionals, groundwater professionals, etc., we are essentially tasked with trying to mitigate and manage a problem that we just didn't create. But that problem is still ours to sort of try to help solve. But in terms of sources or routes of exposure to humans, it generally comes from the environment or consumer products, etc., whether it's through drinking water or food, etc. So they're probably the key exposure pathways to humans. So consumer products, food, and water. And as per the blood results, unfortunately, we do have a fair bit of observed levels of PFAS in our systems. Karl, do you want to comment on this one? Just on mute.
Yep, I was just responding to a question in the Q&A.
I'm sure they're flying through.
They are. Look, a lot of the focus in the last 10 years has been on the use of firefighting foams. And quite often things get over summarized to the point that's for the contaminated land industry that I do a lot of work in, a lot of my work has been around those firefighting foams. And so that focus has been okay. But if you're in the water space, if you're in the wastewater space, if you're in the biosolid space, then you are seeing potentially PFAS that are coming from a whole range of sources, not just firefighting and firefighting foams. So the PFAS NEMP, which we'll talk a little bit about later, it has a table in the back of the NEMP that shows sectors that you should look at and consider if PFAS might be involved in there. That table goes across 4 pages. There's a lot of sectors that it can go into. One click, Brad.
Yeah.
If you really want to know about which PFAS are in which products, to the extent that we know, there's a brilliant paper by Juliana Gluger, which is on the screen there. Whatever the supplementary information for that paper tells you everything you might want to know and a whole lot more. So if you're interested in source of this, definitely that's an extraordinary, valuable resource. But also, the table on the back of the NEP is very helpful too. Yeah. Thanks, Brad.
Cool. Yeah, we've already referred to this document already, but yeah, within Australia, and I recognise a big chunk of the audience are from Australia, that there's obviously a very useful document referred to as the NEMP, or PFAS National Environment Management Plan. One thing I wanted to show here is just the guideline levels that are within the NEMP. There's obviously drinking water quality guidelines, and from what I understand, these targets are likely to reduce further. And you can see and this is again one of the quiz questions for anyone who's participated, the targets for just for ecology protecting ecosystems. We're talking about, for freshwater and intramarine, 0.0023 microgram per litre. I mean, this is, like, my background is wastewater treatment and stormwater, and we're generally used to dealing with milligrams per litre of various contaminants. The concentration of these of PFAS is super low, recognizing that it's a really hard chemical to remove from the environment because of its various properties, but also the target concentrations that the guidance is advising to aspire to achieve are extremely low, but likely, and I'm sure, justifiably so. And obviously, for the guys in the US, obviously, I think it was in May of this year, or I think it was very recently, they obviously announced an update to their PFAS drinking water quality targets as well. I know Karl was going to chime in here.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that we saw those values for maximum contaminant levels for 6 PFAS and a timeline associated with that. And in the last couple of months, US EPA has pulled back a little bit for that. So those PFOA and PFOS, 4 part per trillion, those are being retained, whereas the other PFAS, they're going to, looks like they're going to drop those away and just concentrate more on the PFOS and PFOA. If you go to the next slide, Brad. The other thing is that they've extended the timeline for utilities was being able to meet those. So originally they were talking 2029, now they're talking 2031. But the other thing I want to really point out is that the US EPA seems to have realised, and this is a really good thing, that this is a really difficult problem, and just saying this is what you have to achieve and then letting people lose is not a great thing. So there's also a PFAS outreach portion of dealing with all this to help people understand what their problems are. So I just point to that as being a really good aspect. All right, so let's jump from the US to Australia. And what I've got here is a slide with a whole lot of bits of legislation or regulation that could impact on various parts of the PFAS issue. So on the left-hand side of the screen, I've got bits of regulation that are in our Commonwealth government. So we're a bit like the US, where we've got a bunch of states that have their own laws and rules, but we've also got an overarching government called the Commonwealth government, which is, in a similar way to the US as their federal government. So on the left-hand side of the screen, Commonwealth and federal type instruments, and they're mainly around approvals and registration. So it's okay to use this chemical, it's okay to bring this one into the country by importation, or it's not, that kind of thing. But then those have to get operationalized in some way by the states and territories, who are the ones that deal with the sort of more conventional EPA type policing type functions and licensing, etc. So after point of sale for a chemical. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you've got examples from New South Wales government. So the point isn't to take in all this information. The point is just to go, wow, it's actually a really complex space. And so it's not just all about PFAS being industrial chemicals. Well, as I pointed out before, some pharmaceuticals are PFAS. So the Therapeutics Goods Administration has something to do with here, and AGBET and so on. Next slide, please. And if we look a little more specifically about the guidance for PFAS that's relevant to the water industry, there's obviously going to be things in the guidelines for drinking water, and now we've got guidance for biosolids, whatever. But there are other things that may be less apparent to people. For example, the contaminated land guidance can also be very relevant. If you've got a huge stockpile of biosolids sitting on ground somewhere and it's been raining on top of that that stockpile, well, you're going to have PFAS running off into the surface water and PFAS working its way down towards groundwater. So it can be just an out-and-out contaminated land issue as well, etc. So for that reason, there are a lot of bits of regulation that are relevant to this as well. So on the right-hand side of the screen, I've got a whole bunch of those that are important in Australia, and things like obviously drinking water guidelines, the second from the top there, or the fourth one from the top is our ecological guidelines, where Brad showed some guidelines before from that are relevant to that space. And some of those feed into our PFAS National Environmental Management Plan. This is a tool that's somewhat unique in Australia. I'm not sure of other jurisdictions having something equivalent. It's an extremely important document to help give guidance. So it's not legally binding, but it gives guidance to help people across the country make sensible and consistent management of PFAS in the environment. Next slide, please. And diving a little further into that PFAS National Environmental Management Plan, or NEMP, and all I've done is I've just sort of given ticks or crosses here for things that are more relevant for the water industry as opposed to contaminated land. And the latest version of the NEMP, it has stuff, guidance and guidelines for biosolids. That's something new that appeared this year. The wastewater space, much less. So it does give you some guidance and a bit of a framework, but there are no guidelines as such. And it's kind of a bit of a hole sitting in the NEMP. And I understand why, not a criticism at all, but it definitely is a gap that may or may not be filled at some point for various reasons. So in terms of water, there are guideline values for drinking, which come from NHMRC, and also ecological guidelines, which Brad mentioned before. Now, actually, this is one area we might actually get a bit of rationalisation. We're expecting to see new ecological aquatic guideline values come out, maybe late this year or possibly early next year. And those are likely to be higher than the values that Brad showed. It's probably going to be one of the very, very few instances of seeing numbers go up. We don't normally see that in the PFAS space. There's helpful stuff in the NEMP for soil. There's not really anything terribly helpful at the moment for sediments, and food's not really in scope so much. So that's why it's not there. Anyway, just pointing out that the NEMP covers a lot of ground. It provides a lot of really, really useful stuff. There are some bits there that are still missing, often for very good reasons. Next, please. And of course, all of those bits of guidance that are available, they get updated from time to time. And this slide is particularly for the Australians in the audience, and because these aren't things that are going to be relevant globally as much. But for example, just this morning, the NHMRC released updated drinking water guidelines for PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFBS. So they are literally hours off the press. As I just mentioned a second ago, we're expecting updated ecological aquatic values later this year or soon after. Our contaminated land document, the ASC NEPM, is seriously outdated, and we don't have a timeline for that being updated. Other parts of our guidance, so industrial chemicals management and etc., they have processes going forward as well. So just making the point that it's always a shifting space. We can't just sit back and go, right, if you know what's going on, we have to constantly keep our eye on the shifting regulation and shifting guidance. Next, please. So a couple of changes that appeared on New South Wales EPA's website about 2 weeks ago. And these are sort of just snippets off their website. So one of which is that they are introducing biosolids resource recovery order, and it is going to include PFAS thresholds and other requirements. And the other one I find really interesting is during the transition to NEMP 3, EPA is considering putting monitoring requirements on sewage treatment plant and landfill licenses. So in terms of dealing with wastewater, it's one area that we haven't been leading the world in. We're maybe with a little catch up there, perhaps from say the US, where they've already had some movement in that space. It's just a really good way to start out. It's rather than just slapping requirements on people straight away. Let's understand the problem first. So getting people to monitor. Now, having said that, if you operate a landfill or you operate a sewage treatment plant, you know that comes at a hefty price. PFAS analysis is not cheap. So it's not a trivial thing that's being asked. Nevertheless, it's a very helpful step towards managing the issue. So next, please.
Oops. Solutions. We might need to expedite this a little bit, Karl, because we're running out of time. And I see there's about 20 questions lined up already for us. So,
all right. Okay. We'll do treatment relatively quickly. We don't want to get into the weeds on treatment at all. Look, this is a slide that shows maturity of a whole bunch of treatment technologies. This is for the water space, this one in particular. So treating water, and two really important things to take out of this. One, so if you go to the top right hand of the screen, that's more mature. If you go to the bottom left, that's less mature. If you look top right of the screen, you'll see every technology that is mature, commercially mature, is concentrating and separating PFAS. It's not destroying it. There are some destruction technologies that are getting really close. So if you look at Holt and Squo there, they're getting very, very close. But at the moment, we're really dealing with separation and concentration. Now, that leads you to the question, what do we do with the PFAS once we've separated it and concentrated it? And that's where it brings in the concept of a treatment train. So everybody in the industry talks about treatment trains. So we separate, we concentrate, then it's going to be economically a lot more feasible to apply destructive technology because we're dealing with higher concentrations, lower volumes. So the treatment train is the key. Next. So this is just a similar slide for biosolids. And really what it says is if you want a really, really commercially mature approach, well, you're just heating the bilio out of it and destroying that PFAS in that way. So there are other things that are in development. They're still lagging a bit behind, but this is a really important space. Next slide.
Yeah, and look, this will be the last thing we talk about, but very quickly to Karl's point, Ocean Protect have a PFAS treatment system that's recently developed, but we do use a treatment train. So we essentially use our tried and trusted storm filter, but essentially reconfigured. So if you're not familiar with the storm filter, it's basically just, typically an underground asset that water will come into a chamber and basically fill up, and we just have water come into the radial cartridges. And the absorbent media absorbs pollutants. So historically, we've been using this for 20-something years. There's about 40,000 in Australia. There's about 300,000 globally. But we've essentially just replaced the filter media. Instead of using our media that is targeting typical urban soil pollutants like nutrients and solids and heavy metals, basically replaced it with an activated carbon blend. And long story short, it works really well at removing PFAS. There's a whole bunch of there's a published peer-reviewed journal in the AWA journal paper around how it works, etc. But fundamentally, we're seeing a lot of projects, particularly military bases and airports and fire training facilities, essentially are looking at using this. But if you're keen to find out more, just jump on that website, oceanprotect.com.au/opus filter. I reckon we need to dive into questions. We're probably not going to get through them all. I can see them all racked up, but if people want to ask us questions after today, feel free to do so via our emails. But let's try and get stuck on these questions, shall we, Craig?
Yeah, I think so. Most webinars, we dive into questions during the webinar. This one in particular, because it is such a hot topic, what we noticed was that even on the registration forms, we already had 10 or 15 questions that we were already hoping to address before we even started the webinar. So it is a hot topic. Stay tuned for more details. I see that some of the questions do have to do with plastics and microplastics. Stay tuned for some upcoming content on that one. We'd love to cover that in the future a little more, in a little more detail. But just having a look at the content here in these questions, I do see a few upvoted ones that have already been answered. Karl, if you can hit a few of them while Brad's talking and vice versa. But let's go back to Karl first, because you did answer a couple of them in the background that were upvoted quite a bit. And maybe, Karl, if you could just summarize a couple of things that you've already hit and just let us know what do you think the key takeaways are from the questions that you've answered so far.
Oh, gosh, I've already answered a few questions and I've got myself confused into which ones I have and haven't. But if it's all right, so I've noticed that there's a number of questions about, look, are bans going to help us? So if it's okay, I might just hit because there's a few questions around that. Look, bans can be very helpful. And if you go back to what I was showing with those decreasing concentrations in blood, then you can see that can actually have a meaningful and measurable improvement. But you can't put all of your faith in banning things. For one reason, so I showed how diverse PFAS were. And I mentioned, we'll try telling somebody who needs Prozac or some potentially life-saving drug that they can't take their drug because you're trying to ban all PFAS. So you're going to need to have lots of exemptions, and those exemptions and what's a reasonable exemption, what's not, that's a huge topic in Europe at the moment where they are talking about banning all PFAS. You can end up with having an awful lot of exemptions. But the other thing for a country like Australia, where we import an enormous amount of stuff, how do we know what's in those products and who's responsible for that sort of thing? So bans can be very helpful, but they're not necessarily an answer in and of themselves. So just, I'll leave that one there.
Great. No, thanks. Brad, anything to add to that? Well, Karl frantically checks the rest of the questions.
No, it's all good. I'm happy to move on to other questions. Maybe one answer per question might be what we can manage.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are asking, what can we do about this? So, it is an alarm bell. What can you do about it? People have asked, can you do this and protect yourself against it at home with your own filtering unit? I think there are, a couple of responses about that. Brad, anything you want to say about the household level as opposed to the municipal level that you were talking about?
Yeah, look, there's always ways to mitigate your exposure to a whole bunch of stuff, but yeah, PFAS is one of them. Like if you look at that NEMP list of potential sources of exposure, that might be a good place to start. And but yeah, off the top of my head, carpets, waterproof clothing, etc. If you can minimise your exposure to that you'd probably be a good start.
Yeah, great. And it is something that is an increasing topic, around the world, globally. And I think we've had a couple of comments that apply specifically to Australia and in addition, a few around the world. But you see how relevant this is. Just today, as Karl mentioned, and a few attendees have mentioned as well, just today there were updates in the standards. Do you see these standards getting more stringent over time, Brad? And is that something where, right now we show these exceedances? Do you see the standards changing over time, like in the future? If we had another webinar like this 5 years from now, are there, is the target level? Are we chasing our tail here?
Well, if history is a good predictor of the future, we are going to see a reduction in the target concentrations, which are already stringent. Like Karl mentioned, there might be an increase in a couple of them, but I think the general trend is concentration targets are going to become more and more stringent, and subsequently more and more difficult to achieve, and subsequently more and more expensive to treat and manage at the downstream end. Hence, there's going to be a far greater focus, I hope, on stopping at the source.
Yeah, thanks. A few questions about human biology that are answered in the written answers, and we'll just keep in mind that those watching the YouTube recording won't see these live, but go down to the description and hopefully you'll see what has been addressed in writing. Karl, any others that you wanted to hit? Now we've got about 10 minutes to go.
If it's okay, I might just touch on that last one because it's a really important question. It depends where you are in the world. So if you're in the US, your health-based goal is already 0. You can't get any less than 0. But the US does its regulation for drinking water on the basis of a legislated MCL, which is based on achievability, not a health-based target. So in Australia, we have a health-based target, but so if you're setting it on achievability, then the question isn't so much where is the line in the sand for is this bad for me or not? The question is, can I measure this compound and do I have a technology to treat down to that? And to some extent, that becomes a bit of a legal argument. But yes, as we get better treatment technologies, that may well go down because what's achievable could go down. So it may go down, but for different reasons.
Yeah, excellent. Brad, anything you wanted to add to that one? A few others that you've hit.
No, there's still questions coming through. Like I'm just looking at quite a few of them ask around nature-based solutions for PFAS removal, like floating wetlands or constructed wetlands or stormwater treatment assets with PFAS contamination. Yeah, fundamentally, so floating wetlands or wetlands can act to retain or potentially remove PFAS from the flow. But then what do you do with it? And so whilst it may store PFAS in the plants or the substrate, that then becomes a potential source of contamination as well. So at least with, say, the activated carbon, activated carbon, whether it's in a cartridge or similar, you can physically remove that and appropriately dispose of it. And another question that says, well, what do you do with the cartridges? Generally, if the concentration in the filter media of PFAS is less than about 50 milligram per kilogram, you can dispose it in an appropriate landfill facility, not a special contaminated facility. And at least that is a contained, it's fairly easy to remove and dispose or place in a fairly constrained environment. Whereas I feel as though a lot of nature-based solutions may not be that suitable, mainly because we're dealing with a very unnatural contaminant in PFAS. So yeah, they certainly can remove or retain the PFAS in their plants and substrate, but then what do you do with it? And that does create a headache. You probably have to, at great expense, try to get that material then to an appropriate landfill facility.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And I think you've kind of depressed a few people here,
Right.
Brad, by talking about beer, especially. And a few are wondering if that's why men have the higher concentrations. No, there's other reasons.
There's probably a few reasons. Someone was asking, why do women have lower concentrations? That might be due to menstruation or their ability to get rid of PFAS a little bit better than men. But yeah, it might be due to beer consumption. Let's face it. So, yeah.
Yeah, Karl, back over to you, and maybe without this other screen share on, maybe we can get you back on video. I know we were having some sound issues too, but maybe just try it again, and we'll let you know if the video is causing some of the sound issues. But yeah, back to you again. I'll just let you pick and choose the lowest hanging fruit and the most upvoted questions here as we wrap up the last few minutes of this one.
A really good question here from someone. What available resources do you recommend to stay up to date on PFAS research and studies? Well, I've had my head absolutely, completely day and night absorbed by PFAS for the past 10 years, and I am not on top of studies. There are thousands coming out, every year now, and over an ever widening range of topics. So it's a very, very good question. But the best answer I can give is if you want a nice potted summary of a lot of really useful stuff to do with PFAS, go to the ITRC website. That's the Interstate Technology Research Council of the United States. It's a bunch of regulators who get together and they work with industry and they put together information, summarize it, and they have outstanding resources on PFAS. So to some extent, they've done a lot of hard work for you and continue to do so. So ITRC website, Google it, should find it straight away. Give that one a go.
And just encourage anybody who's attending now live to come back and have a look at the YouTube recording or to the resources available. What we're going to do is summarize these links where they're active hyperlinks that right now we're just discussing, in words, but I want you to be able to click on it and see where it takes you. So we will provide the most relevant ones. A lot of people are saying, well, yeah, there's all this research out there, but a lot of it is behind academic paywalls. And so, could you focus on the ones that are freely available or publicly available? And so, yeah, we may have some that we reference that are behind paywalls, but we'll try to focus on those that everybody can access. Brad, any recommendations on that, on what we'll include there for the resources?
Yeah, great point by Karl. I think that's the one I put in the chat if for people watching at home. Another one that came out yesterday, literally it shows you how much it's hard to keep your finger on the pulse of this, but I found out this because I was tagged on a LinkedIn post, someone plugging this webinar. So thanks for that. The Water Research Australia have literally put out a report around the state of knowledge around PFAS. I've just put a link in the chat. That provides a fairly, digestible, it's like 55 pages worth of all things PFAS. So really, really handy resource.
Yeah, we'll definitely include that in the resources. of Water Research Australia is the parent organization of the Australian Water School. Out of it, a lot of accessible information there, and a lot of partners with that organization who are heavily involved and interested in this topic. So, no, thanks for that shout out there. So, the most upvoted question was the one that we just hit then about resources and academic ones. The next one would be phasing out PFAS. So that one's got a lot of upvotes as well. There's increasing, concerns about this. What products, lowest hanging fruit? what products ought to be phased out, to make the biggest dent in this issue.
Karl, I can chime in, or look. But to Karl's point before, and the blood analysis which is really really useful. Like, we are seeing phasing out of PFAS. Sorry, some PFAS types. But the key concern is, what are they being swapped out with? Karl, you're probably better qualified to answer this one anyway. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, for the most part, we would swap certain PFAS with other PFAS.
So we're losing your audio again. Yep. Maybe stop that video.
PFAS, we're swapping them. Yeah. So the manufacturers will go, well, the PFAS that we're swapping in are better than the ones we're swapping out. There are other people, and there's a lot of academics going, well, no, they're still bad. We still don't want them there. We want them gone entirely. So, this is around a concept called regrettable substitution. And we know that a lot of, we've seen regrettable substitution happen many, many times in the past. Kind of the good thing here is there's a lot of market pressure. Sometimes market pressure is more effective than a ban. So a ban can do some good. But in California, for example, they've got something called Proposition 65. And what Proposition 65 does, it lists chemicals. And once something's listed on that proposition, manufacturers of products or importers, they have to say that that chemical is in that product. And the manufacturers have been surveyed, and they go, and the product suppliers commerce has been surveyed, and they go, once something's on Proposition 65, it's game over. They swap it out because it's about market pressures. People will stop buying it. People stop, you see the thing. So I just make the point that bans aren't the only game in town. There can be other levers we can pull to try and get good outcomes. And sometimes it's about just making people informed.
If I can add to that as well, I feel as though we're missing the whole, we're not learning from our mistakes. The onus of responsibility of demonstrating that these products are safe, whether it's PFAS or an alternative to PFAS, needs to be on the manufacturer. And there's a whole bunch of questions around, who should be responsible or accountable. Clearly, it's the manufacturer. I feel as though water utilities, like I said, stormwater professionals, councils, are having to essentially carry the burden of monitoring and management, and it's just not appropriate. I feel as though the manufacturers of these chemicals need to be held account, and thankfully, fundamentally, a lot of them are. The very early slide I had in this preso was around the media, and a lot of us around manufacturers being held to massive account. Like the key way to get one of these groups or several of these groups to change is to hit them where they hurt the most, and that's in the back pocket. And we are fundamentally seeing this. But the key thing is, the point I want to make is, the onus or responsibility of demonstrating any chemical is safe should be on the manufacturer.
That's an excellent point, and holding that to account in so many other industries. That's you're stuck publicly with a cleanup, and going to the sources and making changes there. Otherwise you're fighting the symptom, not the cause. So I think there's some great comments around that. Some people are looking at this, and I saw one comment there saying, so is it just unavoidable? And I guess from what I've heard here, it's unavoidable to have these kind of in your systems, but having them at a level that makes you sick or makes you die, that is avoidable. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the take home message that we ought to be sending, or are we saying, hey, this is just unavoidable? That's one of the questions here.
If I can comment on that, Karl, and you can chime in. But look, like a whole bunch of stuff in life is unavoidable. Death, taxes, But and same thing for PFAS and say microplastics. But we can certainly reduce our level of exposure. And I think for me, it starts with better understanding of an awareness of the problem. And so being a more educated consumer or user. But for me, again, the onus of responsibility should be on the manufacturer to make sure that their chemicals are appropriately safe.
Yeah,
but also there is a question mark as to how sick it'll make you as well. So again, if you can reduce your exposure, you should be okay. But again, we might change our tune in 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for that. It's just even if people look at this and say, "Oh boy," just throw up your hands. No, it is always going to be worth trying to get as few of these chemicals in our body as possible. So those efforts to reduce that would certainly be commendable. So we've got just a minute or two to go. Karl, any take-home messages that you wanted to mention to wrap it up, with the understanding that we'll put some in writing and put that down in the YouTube description as well. So Karl, any closing remarks?
Yeah, for the waste water biosolids, sector, I think that one of the key things is don't forget the complexity of this class of substances, and the diversity of behaviors and how that impacts on choices for treatment technologies. It's not necessarily the same problem as somebody who's just managing an old legacy firefighting foam issue where a lot of the experience comes from. So that's probably, take home message number one. Take home message number two, we've got that really great example of PFAS concentrations coming down in people's serum, which is wonderful from a public health management perspective. But on the other hand, everywhere we look, if we look in soil and water and biosolids and landfills everywhere, we see PFAS in things, despite the fact that nobody has really been making, the only Western major manufacturer of PFAS phased it out in 2002, 2003. And yet we still see PFAS in our waste streams. Okay. So, and that's another reason why going, well, okay, banning can be really, really helpful. But just remember how persistent these chemicals are. Some of them might just be cycling through our commerce, through resource recovery, through, various aspects sort of things. So we have to make some sensible choices about how we manage those beyond just pointing the finger at somebody else and say, is it your job to manage? Sometimes we have to make the decision to go, right, I'm part of this. And it's, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's why they're called forever chemicals, I guess, and that's the scary part of all this. Brad, bring it home for us while we bring up a couple of slides on what's coming for future content.
Sure. Look, I think the key thing for me is at the start of the preso, you guys asked, do you know much about PFAS? And I think most people said they know a little or not much at all. And I hope this has helped in improving that a little bit. And the resources that were provided and the links, et cetera, and the research, I certainly encourage everyone on this call to find out more because it is certainly a hot topic. And I think the more we know about it, the more we can act appropriately on it. And thanks so much for the Australian Water School for highlighting this as a key issue. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. And do subscribe to Brad's other podcasts on ocean, protecting the oceans, basically, stormwater management. There is a awesome podcast that Brad hosts that's got lots of expert presenters coming on to help find out how we can better manage what rains and runs off down our streets and how to keep pollutants out of the waterways and out of the ocean. So we'll include some of those links below as well in the YouTube recording, which will be emailed to you a few days after this session. So look for your attendance in the email and do fill out that feedback survey in the end. Let us know, what do you want to see more of? There's a hot topic. Should we dive into more detail? Should we do some courses on this, some training, a couple of additional webinars where we get more into the weeds on this, hit some international areas where there might have been some of these issues popping up? Let us know. Fill out that survey. So what is coming up next? We have got another webinar coming up on the water quality in the Murray-Darling Basin. And also, if you want to know about how to monitor from the sky, from satellites, from aerial photos, how to monitor and map surface water, we've got that coming up in the next couple of weeks, in addition to a 15% discount coupon you'll see here for pastas, like that name, for groundwater modeling. And have a look also for QGIS users. We've got some content on that as well. So let us know what you want to see more of. This is what we're bringing you in response to previous comments. We do look forward to seeing you again with the Australian Water School. We'll see you next time.